May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, the one who gives us strength and the one who redeems us. Amen. Please be seated. Ann Weidig was full of life, vivacious. Ann Weidig never met a stranger. She was a lifelong educator, an English teacher at an Episcopal school, no less. She never met a stranger. She was full of life. She encouraged children to ask questions. She was fascinated with the mind and learning and memorizing things, as teachers make students do. She was fascinated with all of that. The sad irony, of course, was that when Ann Weidig was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in her early 50s, that wonderful life of memory, that wonderful world of teaching, all began to unravel. She lived with Alzheimer's and dementia for the better part of a decade before she died. As many of you perhaps know, either family members or friends who live with that awful disease, you literally see life being sapped from someone. It's not only their memory that they lose, but they actually lose their very life. That's the way Alzheimer's is. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, had a word for that. It was actually a medical term, a medical word that we use all the time, called amnesia. That when you forget, the ancient Greeks believed that you actually lose some essence of who you are. You lose some essence of life itself when you forget. The Hebrews understood this very well. And if you remember your Old Testament, if you remember your Hebrew scripture, you remember that book called Numbers, that book I never understood as a child. Before the service, I was in the narthex reminiscing somewhat fondly about sword drill, if any of you ever played that game called sword drill. And I remember the book in the Bible that I never really understood as a child was that book called Numbers. Because page after page, you hear that so-and-so begot so-and-so, and then they had so-and-so. And I always wondered, why in the world is that important? As I grew older and matured, I began to discover why it's important, because the Hebrew people realized it is life-giving, life-sustaining to never forget. That it's important to remember, that in remembering, there is something life-giving. And so this week at Passover, our Jewish brothers and sisters all around the world observe that on this day we remember what happened so long ago. It's life-giving and life-sustaining. The mind is a very mysterious thing. This past Sunday, we heard Father Sandy talk about breath and how breath is mysterious. I would suggest to you that our mind, our brain, is exactly the same. Why is it that I can remember almost paragraph by paragraph a sermon I preached and a sermon I wrote 20 years ago, but I couldn't tell you what I had for dinner Monday night? The mind is a fascinating, mysterious thing. Ann Weidig, both she, her husband, and her family began to discover the same thing as life slowly left her. And so we say she had amnesia, she forgot. The Greeks had another word for another medical word, a wonderful word called anamnesis. It's the opposite of amnesia. anamnesis. It means to remember. So that if you forget, if life leaves you by forgetting, life returns to you and comes for you when you remember. Some of you may know that all too well. Perhaps you smell something and it reminds you of your grandmother's kitchen, or it reminds you of a house you used to live in. And you, at that moment, when you remember, you are literally transported back to that very house, to that very grandmother. Perhaps you hear a piece of music, and you can recall where you were in 1972 and who you were walking down the sidewalk with. And you, in that very moment, are transported back to that very night. To remember is life-giving. Anamnesis. And for the Greeks, when they heard that word remember, it wasn't some cognitive recall. It wasn't a warm and fuzzy cognitive recall. They understood it that what you do when you remember is you are redoing what you did on that day so long ago. You actually redo it. It's not just recall. On that night, he was gathered with his friends. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And at supper with them, he gave them bread and he gave them wine. And in that room with his closest of friends, he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." And so what we do here this evening is we literally redo what was done in that room with Jesus' friends. We literally redo it, not cognitively recall it and think, oh, wasn't that a nice thing to do? We actually redo it. The memory is a funny thing. So many Christians all around the world on this day, as soon as they hear the phrase Maundy Thursday, their memory is a feat. And so many of them get nervous, and so many I know don't even come to church because they're afraid that the priest or minister is going to call upon the whole congregation to come forward to have their feet washed. So no fears to all of you. This is not an open call to have your feet washed. But that is what some of us remember about this night. That's kind of funny because as much as we think Maundy Thursday is about washing of feet, it is actually about the institution of the Eucharist. And so every Sunday and every service when we celebrate the Eucharist, it all started back on that night so long ago when Jesus was with his closest friends, or according to the hymn, his chosen band. That chosen band were the biggest group of losers and misfits you would ever come across. For in the very end, on this night, when Jesus needed them, when Jesus really should have counted on them the most, they ran out the door and fled and looked out for themselves because they knew they were all about to be in a bunch of trouble. His chosen band, his closest friends, a group of losers, a group of people who argued among themselves, a group, as we heard tonight, had to ask Jesus repeatedly, I don't understand that. Could you please repeat? Could you tell us what you mean? Even Peter, the most outspoken, the one who believed he was in charge, didn't get it. That really is wonderful news for all of us. that really is good news for all of us. On this night, the most wonderful of all nights, let us remember as we make our way up to this rail for communion, let us all remember that we are in that room. We are the chosen band of a ragtag group of misfits who have decided to follow Jesus. Amen.